Hello, in this video I'm going to go over the evaluating functions from a graph and evaluate piecewise functions graphically because it's the same concept. So in the first three, you have to plug in something from the domain. So like put in an input and then get an output. And so the output is the thing you're looking for when you're evaluating functions. Same thing from a graph, except the input or the numbers from the domain are things on the x-axis, okay? And so they just show you all these inputs from whatever they can show for the particular graph. So this right here shows you what the outputs are, so like the numbers in the range for every number for this function between -10 and 10, and all the numbers in between. But the one that they're looking for, okay, so when the input is -6, what is the output? So that is the value of f of -6. So here, right, this is the input. To figure out the output, I just need to figure out the y value at that particular location. So the y value, this is f of -6. And so that y value is just 4. So let's just type in 4. Okay. So let's just do at least one more here, and then I'll talk about the piecewise functions. So again, the input for this is 4, all right? So that's just going to be your x value. So they show all the inputs from -10 to 10 in this particular function. And so when you're trying to evaluate it, okay, you're trying to figure out like, okay, what's the output? Okay, so what is a number that comes out in the range for this particular input? So this would be f of 4, okay, which is just the number 2. So I'm going to plug in 2. 2, no I don't. I'm actually going to type it, 2. Okay, and so they're showing you the same thing that I did. All right, so let's just look at the piecewise functions, which are pretty much the same. So evaluate piecewise functions graphically. The only difference is this, is that not just one equation could be used for this function. They don't give you any of the function equations. I'll tell you that the last two functions we looked at were absolute value functions. This is a linear function with some sort of discontinuity. So it's only tricky at the input value of -2, because at the input value of -2, it's not the number on the line, because there's an open circle here. It's actually the number right here. That would be your output for the input value of -2. But do they ask for -2? No. They ask for the input value, or the number in the domain they give you is -5. So this is the input, or the number in the domain that they're kind of considering. Okay, so -5 is here. And they don't actually even give you the number in the domain past -7. Now you can see the pattern, but because this is piecewise, you can't assume anything. And so your output is 8. So we would consider this output to be equal to f of -5. Okay. And really, it's just the value of the function at -5. So that would be 8. Submit answer. Okay, I'll do one last one, and I'll talk about any sort of discontinuities, even if we don't have to answer it, because you might get one. So here, there's a couple of weird things. One, this is a function with a restricted domain, because you don't see any output values for -10, -8, -6, -4. Anything to the left of this doesn't have an output, so this would be considered as undefined because there's no graph there. And again, like when you're talking about restricted domain, we're talking about X values. So like it doesn't really matter, like what the Y values are per se. It just matters what you can plug in. I couldn't plug in a -4 according to this graph. But f of -3 is actually right here. So -3 is your X value or your input. It is the number in the domain. It's not part of the restriction because the number in the domain, the restriction starts after -3. So if it was like -3.01, you wouldn't have anything. But this is -3, and so f of -3 would just be -3, because this would be -3, and then this would be f of -3, the Y value. So that would be -3. The other tricky one here is that if they ask for f of 2, your answer would be this point right here, because these are all open circles. So this is what's called a discontinuity. So these can get a little tricky. You might get an undefined in one of your problems, and that's really just for input values that don't have any pieces of the graph there. All right, I hope this helps. Let's just make sure I'm right.